Greetings, brothers and sisters. Shalom. Assalamu alaikum. Adnastana. I just got back from my lodge, and Happy New Year to you. I thought I'd kick the new year off with this particular segment. It's some material that I recorded last year. We should have brought this to you last year. I apologize for waiting this long, but in this particular segment, the Catholic Perennialist is going to return to Points of Light Radio, and among the things he's going to be talking about, he is going to be talking about Jesus as the Sun God, right? He will be discussing Astro-theology of the Holy Family and the 12 Apostles, and an alleged, get this, 13th Apostle, right? And the life of Christ as the recapitulation of the sun cycle, and there'll be much more in here that he talks about. Like I said, this was quite a conversation I had with him. So, like I said, should have brought it to you last year. I apologize for that. But let's move forward, brothers and sisters. Trim your lamps, follow me, and I think you're going to find this very fascinating. I know I did just talking to him. So let's move forward. Catholic Perennialist, welcome back to Points of Light Radio.
Thanks for having me.
Now, it's been a while. It hasn't been that long, so why don't you tell, first of all, you're here again for part two of our last segment to shed more light on the evolution of fraternalism, its rituals, and its degrees. So, first on your list of topics was Jesus as the sun god, kind of a conclusion of it. So, part A, you said, was Imperial Cult Sol Invictus.
That's correct. The early church mirrored much that was already the imperial cult at the time, the cult of Sol Invictus. And nowhere is this more evident than in the Gospels themselves, because the story of Jesus is the story of one man who exists in centrality to an orbit of 12 other men. And he himself has, as a consort, Mary Magdalene, and or his mother at times, both Marys. And they're solar symbols. And we know this because in Revelation, Mary is seen in chapter 12 of Revelation as the woman clothed with the sun, with the moon at her feet. And so all of this is astro-theological. And so Jesus personifies the sun, and in so doing replaces the imperial sun cult. But still, in the earliest days, it's still functioning as a brotherhood. And in fact, Paul constantly references the brethren. He constantly references the body, quote unquote, the body, that the believers consist of if they partake in the Eucharist, that they become one body, one flesh with Christ. But as it pertains and as it connects to fraternalism, the modern day Blue Lodge is a temple to the sun. And we know this because the three major officers of the lodge represent the sun in the east, the west, and the south. And the north remains dark because that's the one place that the sun never shines from. And the various circumambulations that occur during degree rituals are symbolic of the sun and its rotation, as it was understood in centuries past, its rotation around the earth. But the centrality of the sun in the lodge system is identical to the centrality of the sun within the Christian system, if we understand Christ to be a solar symbol.
Okay. Now, you also wanted to talk about astro-theology of the Holy Family and the 12 apostles. And of course, there's also the rejected 13th apostle. What are
That's
your
correct.
thoughts
Yep.
on? Okay.
Well, the parallels are not always clear, but there are clear parallels of the 12 apostles to the 12 signs of the zodiac. And so, just to give you an example, Matthew would be Libra because Libra are the scales, and Matthew was a tax collector. And so, you can picture Matthew at his toll booth collecting taxes, weighing them in the balance. And so Matthew represented by Libra, Peter as Aries, the ram, is the one prone to violence. And if we remember in the Garden of Gethsemane, he pulls out a sword and strikes off the ear of the servant of the high priest. And so he has that martial quality that you would expect from Aries or that you would expect from a male ram. James and John are both fishermen and they're both brothers. And so collectively they're represented by Pisces, which is a twin fish symbol. And then Thomas, who is also called Didymus. Didymus means twin, and Gemini means twin. And so Thomas Didymus can be represented by Gemini. And then Judas Iscariot is variously represented by your fall and winter signs, Capricorn, Cancer, and Scorpio, because he's the one that deals the death blow to Christ and betrays him. That, in addition to his quasi apostle Mary Magdalene, can be seen as the lunar symbol, and that's very common in these Middle Eastern sects. That there will be a central teacher, but he'll have a female consort, and he, being the sun figure, has a consort that is figurative of a lunar symbol. And so this is what we see in Revelation, that Mary becomes this lunar symbol. She's very much associated with the moon. And if you look at any picture of Mary of Guadalupe, that is the representation of Mary most used by Hispanics in their expression of the faith. He's always situated standing on the moon. And so Christ as the sun symbol is central to these 12 disciples, in much the same way that Hercules has his 12 labors. And so the sun moves through his 12 labors with Hercules, and Jesus has his 12 disciples that he interacts with, and he also has his consort in Mary, either the Magdalene or his mother. Now, the 13th apostle is associated with the 13th zodiac sign, which not many people know about, but it's called Ophiuchus. And Ophiuchus is the snake handler. And it's vague. It vaguely bears the shape of a man handling a snake. And if you see a drawing superimposed over the sign, it makes more sense. But the only reason you would ever need a 13th zodiac sign is if you had a 13-month calendar. And the Hebrews actually did have a 13-month calendar because theirs was a lunar calendar, and a lunar month is roughly 28 days. 12 of those will not equal 365, and so every year you fall behind. And so if the barley harvest is not ripe by a certain point, you'll simply add another month. And that 13th month, you might say, is represented by this 13th sign, which in most instances is a rejected sign. It's simply ignored. And it falls between November and December. Ophiuchus is much like St. Paul. St. Paul is this 13th apostle. And if we read very closely, he's not that much accepted by what he calls the 12. The 12 apostles are this inseparable, indivisible collective that Paul is never really a part of. He has an uneasy truce with them early on, but by the time James writes his epistle, he's clearly writing against the Pauline gospel. And in the book of Revelation, the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven has 12 foundation stones for the 12 apostles, but obviously it doesn't have the 13th apostle, which is Paul. And so Paul is the rejected apostle. At least he's rejected by the initial 12 disciples and apostles, although he's later reconciled to the church, and much of Christianity's theology is now based on Paul, ironically enough. But the reason that Paul is represented by the snake handler is that when Paul was a missionary to the island of Malta, he was building a fire, and as he reached into this stack of firewood, he was bitten by a snake, and he shakes the snake off and is not harmed by it. And so, for that reason, he was considered blessed by God by the Maltesians, and was able to evangelize many of them on that account. So Paul is the snake handler of these apostles, and he's represented by Ophiuchus, the rejected third.
Pardon me, though. Now,
Yeah.
don't forget, Judas killed himself. There was a man that elected as a disciple to take his place.
Correct.
Does he not fall into that any of this theory?
The way that Peter in the book of Acts talks about Judas, he's excluded, and it said he reads a prophecy. He says, "Let his bishopric another take," and so they cast lots, and it falls to Matthias.
That's it.
And so, go ahead.
No, that's it. That does he fall into these signs, these zodiac signs?
The problem is that we don't know enough about Matthias to say exactly where he falls in, and I'll say that numerologically, the 12 represent the zodiac signs, but it's not always clear who is represented or being represented by what.
Okay.
And in some cases, the representation even falls outside of the 12. And so the water bearer, for instance, Aquarius, that's most likely John the Baptist, who was not a member of the 12, but he was associated with Christ before he had formed that core 12 disciples. And going further, Jesus also sent out lesser disciples. Not many people know this, but it's mentioned in the synoptics. He sends out 70 or 72 lesser disciples that he calls apostles. And these were evangelists all throughout Judea. And 72 is an interesting number because 72 is one quintile of the 360-degree system that the Babylonians had developed. And so every 72 years you move through, I think it's 5 degrees of the zodiac, and double 72 would be the number 144, which is associated with the 144 chosen of Israel from the book of Revelation. And so that number 72 is extremely important, and that also factors in to the zodiac as well. There was a time when there was only, as the ancients understood it, there was only 72 constellations in the sky. And so the significance of the numbers is always and ever present, but how it relates to and how it's expressed through the symbolism and the stories of the zodiac is not always clear.
So the other thing is you're talking about life, the life of Christ as recapitulation of the sun cycle. So what was that like? How would you interpret that?
So basically it's a recapitulation of also the solar year. And so early on in the year, you encounter, I say early on in the year, it's our new year, roughly January into February. You encounter Aquarius, and Aquarius is the water bearer, the one that carries the pitcher, and he pours out the water. And so Christ's ministry, the beginning of it, is when he is baptized by John the Baptist. And in the summer months, he is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, which is Leo, and that's when he comes into his fullest strength. This is, you could say, when he enters Jerusalem on a donkey, and he's heralded as the Messiah, and they sing Hosanna in the highest. And then not long after he reaches his pinnacle, his zenith, he reaches, you could say, his encounter with the autumnal equinox, where in rapid succession he's hit by the betrayal of Judas, the Sanhedrin, and then the judgment by Pilate, represented by the negative signs of Capricorn, Cancer, and then finally Scorpio. So Capricorn being a dual-natured animal, both fish and mammal, it has this this feeling or this representation of being double-minded and a turncoat. And so that's the Judas character who betrays. And then he is beaten by the Sanhedrin. And so the Cancer is the crab, and he mangles but does not kill. And then Scorpio is the sting of death. And so that's when Pilate deals the death blow through the crucifixion. And so you can find clues, and it's not always as explicit as we would like, but at the high points of that solar year, Christ is moving through his passion until he finally gets to his death, and then finally wraps all the way back around to the springtime where he receives the resurrection.
Interesting. Now, coming to the conclusion, you have Christianity as a sum of all classical myth. What does that mean?
Basically, you can find in Christ, in the canonical Christ, in the Christ of Scripture, in the Christ of theology, you can find elements of every single Mediterranean mystery religion. And many of these began as fraternities. And Mithraism is probably in direct competition to Christianity, its fiercest competitor. And much that Christianity is and became probably was in competition and as a response to the competition from Mithraism. So things like the being washed in the blood of a bull, for instance, in Mithraism, becomes being washed in the blood of the Lamb in baptism in Christianity. There's a Eucharistic wafer given within Mithraism. It becomes the Eucharist of Christianity. Christianity introduces wine and Jesus as one who turns water into wine, and that's very Bacchae, very Dionysian. Jesus has the keys of hell and of death, and that's very Osiris. Jesus goes through his descent into hell and his annual resurrection through the solar cycle. That's like Persephone descending into Hades. And so all of this encompasses the various Eleusinian mysteries, the Mithraic mysteries, the Syrian mysteries, and the Orphic mysteries. Basically, all of it funnels into Christianity, partly because Christianity at a later date has the stamp of approval of the empire. But everyone from all these other fraternities, from all these other mystery schools, they bring their mysteries into Christianity and incorporate it into the theology of Christ. And so in that way, Christianity is the heir of all of these things. And then fast forward to the 17th century and the origins of Freemasonry. It is Christian men, by and large, that build up the mythos of the lodge. And what do they use? What do they use as the mythos? It's another passion narrative, except this time with Hiram. But Hiram, again, is struck down by three ruffians, just like those three zodiac signs that do harm to Christ and finally kill him. So these things are in parallel, so much so that the old mystery schools that we think have died have actually lived on within Christianity, within the church.
Interesting. And you're saying that, so you're saying that in many ways they copied some of the, they essentially were copying some of what they heard in these other mystery schools and schools of thought into parts of of Christianity?
Correct. Yeah, and that's the only way I have of explaining how these similarities come about, is that there came a point in the 5th century when Christianity became the only legal state religion. And so everyone was forced to abandon their old fraternities, and the Orphic mysteries and the Eleusinian mysteries and the Mithraic mysteries were abandoned, and many of the Mithraims, their underground temples, were simply boarded up or blocked up, and they've been preserved ever since, and you can find them in relatively pristine condition. It's because by law, by Roman law, you had to abandon these things. But you couldn't take the theology out of these people. When they entered the church, they carried that theology into the church. And so everything that Osiris was, that Mithras was, that Dionysius was, comes to reside in Christ. And Christ becomes all things to all men.
Well, I know that the Apostle Paul did mix some of that in, because he talked about how one of the one of the gods or something talked about, in him we live and move and have our being. He was incorporating that saying as into the Jesus, as being Jesus.
Yes, that was the Mars Hill sermon
That's
in
Marshall.
Acts,
Yeah.
and he was quoting, I think, a Stoic. I think he was quoting a Stoic, but so much that was Platonism comes into Christianity too. It's not just the
Oh.
mystery schools; it's also the Platonic schools, the Neoplatonism, and Neoplatonism, probably hearkening all the way back to Pythagoreanism, had a Trinity, and so the language of the Trinity and the mechanics of the Trinity and the metaphysics really is borne out in Plato first, and then absorbed by the church. And by the time we get to Tertullian, he can speak in Trinitarian language. And Christianity is really a sum of all of this Mediterranean religious and philosophical thought, and the church absorbs all of it and rejects very little, actually. So what began in the Mediterranean world as you could say a kaleidoscope of religions, local gods, spiritism, condensed over time into several major cults, and then over time again condensed into one singular cult, mandated by the emperor. But the reason that Christianity won out where other mystery schools did not and other fraternities did not was, number one, it was co-ed, and it was open to all. So Mithraism was not only male only, but it was only open to the military. So you had to be a soldier to be a part of Mithraism. Whereas Christianity, it accepted everyone, the rich, the poor, the slave, the free, the Jew, the Greek, male and female. And the universality of Christianity is what was so appealing. And the fact that in adopting the worship of Christ, you left behind no major tenet of faith that you held before. Because many of these other faiths or many of these other fraternities offered a type of salvation, because it offered, number one, a belief in a singular God, the unity of divinity, and then the immortality of the soul. And so in leaving Mithraism or in leaving the Eleusinian mysteries and becoming a member of the church through baptism, you become a member of a brotherhood, but also none of your essential beliefs have changed. You maybe worship the God of the Hebrews now, but your essential belief in the immortality of the soul and the unification or the monadic nature of divinity, and in a blessed afterlife for those who live righteously, none of that changes. So it's actually quite an easy transition for a lot of men to make in the first, second, third, fourth centuries.
So is that why you feel that Christianity, you talked about how was victorious over competing cults, and also there was Constantine's conversion. You said
Correct.
that probably helped.
More than anything, once he converts, he begins basically looting and robbing pagan temples and taking that money and building churches. And he can only do this with partial success in Rome because Rome is already full of temples. So he can only build on the outskirts of Rome. So he picks up his entire entourage and moves to what was originally called Byzantium, over near the Black Sea. And he refounds it as Constantinople. And because that was a sleepy little fishing village at the time, and it didn't have such infrastructure, he could pour imperial resources in and build churches now in the heart and center of the city. And so Constantinople, even more so than Rome, becomes the Christian epicenter. And it becomes popular. And if you want to court imperial favor, then you become a Christian. You become a member of the church. And only with the exception and the brief exception of Julian the Apostate, is this policy changed from the time of Constantine all the way through the end of the empire. And during this time, it transitions. At first, Paul can speak of mysteries. Paul can speak of the brotherhood, and Christians prior to this were meeting in catacombs and in secret. And it looked much like a fraternal system that required secrecy. It becomes exoteric under the emperors. After it receives the approbation of the emperors, it becomes exoteric and far more literal in its approach and interpretation. And so no longer can Christ be a solar symbol. He has to be, in every aspect of him in Scripture, has to be strictly historic and literal. And this produces problems, and those who have studied the Scriptures very closely can start to see inconsistencies. And it's because the original authors never intended for it to be strict history as we understand it. But it was that transition from the esoteric to the exoteric where most people lost sight of Christianity as this fraternal mystery school.
Now, you were saying that the rise of liberalism and Christianity's decline versus its original mystery religion. Now, I thought, for instance, when you talked about that, you were talking about how John in the book of Revelation talks to the 7 churches in Asia, and at that point there was a decline in some of the Christian. He talked about some of those churches were having persecution, or that they were losing some of their conviction, for that matter, that even the ones that weren't being persecuted. Could you not think that maybe that was part of Christianity's decline at that point? Or
Certainly, he gives evidence of that, particularly the Church of Laodicea. He talks about how worldly they are in terms of material wealth. So Laodicea was an extremely rich city. And there was also a lot of compromise, and he speaks about, I think it's the Church of Ephesus, where Satan dwells. This was home to a large temple to Zeus. And so the idea coming from the text is that Zeus is actually the chief archon of the world, what Paul calls the god of this world, which is Satan. And there is a sense in which compromise was taking place because men were eating food sacrificed to idols. But there again, that was what Paul was telling them to do. He said, when you sit down to eat, ask no questions about the meat set before you, for the sake of your conscience. So Paul was saying that as long as you don't know it was sacrificed to idols, go ahead and partake.
Yeah.
And this becomes a point of compromise that is condemned by John in Revelation. But when I say that the decline came through literalism, not liberalism, but literalism, there were 2 schools of thought. The Alexandrian school was a school of thought that dealt in symbolism, and of them, probably the chief amongst them might have been Origen. Origen was an early saint of the church, an early doctor of the church that was later rejected on account of his playing very fast and loose and incorporating too much Platonism into his Christianity. And the school of thought that eventually won out was the school of thought of Damascus. And Damascus was far more Hebrew in its expression, far more literal, and took everything as strictly historic rather than symbolical or
allegorical
or abstract.
Yeah.
And so what we lose in this battle for orthodoxy in the early centuries is we lose the abstract comprehension of the faith. And once the West turned scientific in the early modern period, and scientific methods are applied to the Scriptures, a lot of people give up their faith because it doesn't hold up to such scientific scrutiny. And that's because what's been abandoned is the abstract principles. It is the allegorical principles, which, if they were held to, would hold no matter what science said. Because truth, as Jesus expressed it in parable, is actually best understood through allegory and not through strict history.
Well, he did say that you have to accept this like a little child.
Correct.
In other words, you're not. Maybe he was saying, don't take it so literally.
I think that's absolutely a good way of approaching it. That as a child looks at things in simplicity, you're not supposed to be scientifically combing through the Scriptures, because it was never written to hold up to such scrutiny. It was never written as a strictly historical document in the way that we understand it. It was written to be true and to be truth, but it was not written as like a newspaper.
Very, very true. Well,
Okay. I've got to the end of my outline here. I think we've covered the whole topic.
Okay. Thank you for your time tonight, sir, and all the best to you.
You too. You have a good evening.
That was our old friend, the Catholic Perennialist, brothers and sisters, back here blessing us with more of his gems of insight into the origins, shall we say, of fraternalism. You've heard me say this before, that a good degree not only gives you a lesson for the lodge, but a lesson for life. I think, over these past segments that we've done with the Catholic Perennialists, we've learned a lot that can not only benefit our knowledge of the lodge, but our knowledge of other things, right? Where did these symbols, not just in the lodge, but outside of the lodge, religious symbols, where did they emanate from? We can see that there's a lot, nothing is as it seems. You get that feeling that nothing is as it seems, right? I enjoy having him here because he really gives us something here that can really benefit our knowledge, like I said, not just of the lodge, but of many of the other aspects that we see here in everyday life, right? And you're seeing as well how in my talks with him, and I've read the Bible quite extensively, and over the time I can see, especially with the New Testament, just where the apostles, what they were really up against, right, as they tried to spread the gospel, as they tried to get their message out there. There was a lot of other different mystery schools and so on, and cults out there that were competing for that. And in many ways, not much different when it comes to the faith community today, that there are so many different schools of thought, isn't there? Right? But I'm going to leave you, the listener and viewer, to decide how you feel about what you heard and seen here today. And I welcome you. This is another one of those things where I really want to see some feedback, in the comment section, because there's quite a bit here, isn't there? And that's all I'm gonna. Like I said, I'm gonna leave it there, and we are going to, and I'll allow you to. Like I said, I really encourage you to leave your comments and input on this particular segment in the details section. But as usual, I want to draw your attention to the PayPal link in the details section of this podcast, where you can hit on that link, make a voluntary donation to Points of Light Radio. We will use that to move the podcast forward. I also want to draw your attention to the fact that this podcast is available on both YouTube and Spreaker. Please share, like, and subscribe when viewing Points of Light Radio on YouTube. I also welcome, as I keep saying, your comments and input, especially on segments like this. I really want to see it, right? You can follow Points of Light Radio on my Facebook page at facebook.com/Points of Light Radio. I encourage you to follow me on there. I encourage you to like that Facebook page, right? My X handle is at PO Light Radio. My Bluesky handle is at polightradio.bsky.social. You can see the link to my Spotify channel, as well as my Points of Light Radio store. Brothers and sisters, until we meet again, just step into the light.